20 years ago, the Central Tibetan Administration, CTA, imposed a ban on the religious practice of Dorje Shugden. To justify the ban, the CTA made many serious allegations and claims, which they repeated many times over 20 years. Most recently on November 14th, by the release of the CTA documentary, Shugden Protesters, Allegations versus Facts. I'm here with Pastor Kong Jinai to examine the many contradictions contained in this video. Good morning, Pastor Jinai. Let's start with the Chinese link. In this video, at 1 minute 47 seconds, it is said that the Dorje Shugden practice is actually a tool of is a political tool of the Chinese government to undermine the Dalai Lama. Is there any truth in that?
I would like to say categorically that Shugden practitioners have no official links with the Chinese leadership. For the last 20 years, this is something that has been asserted, something that has been accused of by the Tibetan leadership, that Shugden practitioners are somehow misguided or influenced by the Chinese leadership, and this is simply not true. In the latest assertion, they claim that based on a leaked Chinese memo, that there's this connection. They use the testimony of disgruntled, so-called self-proclaimed Shugden practitioners like Lama Tseta to back up this claim that there is some kind of connection between the Chinese leadership and Shugden practitioners. This is simply not the case. What I would like to ask is, where is the proof? Where is the evidence of this? Hard proof, hard evidence, photographs, receipts. There are 4 million Shugden practitioners all over the world, Martin, and for all that they claim, they say that we receive money, they say that we get instructions and whatnot. Show me one receipt, show me one bank receipt, one transfer, one so-called photograph of some alleged meeting that has taken place between Chinese officials and Shugden Lamas. So let me go back to what I referred to earlier, which was this leaked Chinese memo. I've actually read this Chinese memo, which is available freely online. And in this memo, all the Chinese leadership talk about is protecting the religious freedoms and rights and equal opportunities to worship for all Tibetans within Tibet. They don't make a mention and they don't make any delineation between this religion and that religion, this faith, that faith, this deity and that deity. To them, it's all the same. Everyone deserves the equal right to practice whoever they wish, free from the fear of persecution. This, Martin, should be something that the Tibetan leadership is rejoicing in. They should be happy that another leadership is exercising their duty of care towards the Tibetan people to protect their religious freedoms. The Tibetan leadership should not be taking up one line out of context, selectively manipulating it to somehow show that there is some alleged link between the Chinese leadership and the Dorje Shugden practitioners. This is a lie. It's an outright lie.
As a matter of fact, the ban didn't begin with this reason. The ban began when the CTA claimed that Shugden is actually a spirit and is therefore harmful. The practice is therefore harmful to the Dalai Lama. Can you comment on that?
That, you're right, is the original reason for why the ban was enforced in 1996, 20 years ago, when they claimed that the worship of Dorje Shugden is spirit worship or demon worship, and therefore to rely on Dorje Shugden is to guarantee yourself, I guess, a rebirth in the 3 lower realms. That should you rely on Dorje Shugden, you actually no longer consider a Buddhist. This claim in itself is completely illogical. For the simple reason that His Holiness the Dalai Lama relied on Dorje Shugden himself for over 30 years. Are the CTA, are the Tibetan leadership therefore claiming that for 30 years, I guess, the Dalai Lama wasn't even a Buddhist, that he wasn't even a monk because he worshipped Dorje Shugden? Shugden practice has been around for 400 years, Martin. And for the last 400 years, countless lamas of various traditions have relied on Dorje Shugden. Not just monks, lamas, but lay people too. So are the CTA, the Tibetan leadership, therefore claiming that all these Shugden practitioners for the last 400 years were not even Buddhist? Then where does that leave us? Where does it leave the Buddhist community? Where does it leave the Tibetan Buddhist tradition to say that Shugden worship is spirit worship and therefore everyone is not Buddhist?
But didn't the CTA also say that it is because of this worship of Dorje Shugden that the Tibetan cause had failed thus far?
Yes, they have claimed that in the last 20 years. Again, another one of their original reasons to make sure that people felt an emotional urgency and emotional need to suppress the practice of Dorje Shugden. As you can imagine, it's understandable that the so-called Tibetan cause is something that evokes a very emotional response from the Tibetan people. So to link the failure of the Tibetan leadership to actually regain or to actually gain whatever political goals it is that they have in mind. To link this failure to Dorje Shugden is a very easy and convenient one. But when you make the claim that Shugden practice harms the so-called Tibetan cause, what you're actually saying is that all the Buddhas in the entire Tibetan Buddhist pantheon, of which there are countless, are all completely powerless to help the Tibetan leadership regain Tibet or to gain their political goals. You are saying that all the Dharma protectors like Pandan Lamo, even Nichung, who is the state oracle, the state protector, is completely powerless against this so-called spirit, that they can't do anything to mitigate the effects of the so-called spirit on the Tibetan cause.
So this Chinese link, so-called alleged Chinese link, is just yet another of those baseless allegations which started with Dorje Shugden being a spirit worship, therefore harmful. Dorje Shugden is the reason why the Tibetan cause has failed. And after some time, that people can see how hollow these reasons are. So the latest is now Dorje Shugden people are aligned to is actually merely tools of the Chinese government.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, in the same video, around 4 minutes 37 seconds, the Sikyong, or Prime Minister of the Central Tibetan Administration, Lobsang Sangye, claimed very firmly that there's been no discrimination against Dorje Shugden practitioners, that they get equal rights, that they have the IC. Basically, what he's saying is that Shugden practitioners are treated equally to non-practitioners.
I don't know where the Sikyong got that idea from, but it can't be that all Tibetan Shugden practitioners have it made up in their minds that there's some kind of discrimination against them. I mean, the most clear and obvious sign is the Tibetan leadership themselves debating and then passing 4 resolutions in Parliament ratifying the discrimination of Shugden practitioners. They themselves enacted it into law. They themselves debated it and then made it official that there should be state-sponsored discrimination against Shugden practitioners. So for the Sikyong to sit there and claim that there is no discrimination actually nullifies and maybe kind of reflects on the fact that maybe he doesn't know what's going on in his leadership, that he's not aware of these 4 resolutions that were passed before his time. You know, when you're talking about signs that are plastered all over the Tibetan settlements, identifying Shugden practitioners with their faces, their photographs, their names, their addresses, their supposed crime, which is to rely on Dorje Shugden, how much more obvious can it be that there is discrimination against Shugden practitioners? There are signs and posters stuck up on water tanks. There are signs outside restaurants and shops refusing service to Shugden practitioners. The discrimination is very, very clear, Martin, and this discrimination isn't just within Tibetan settlements, it's even traveled outside. It even affects Tibetan Buddhist communities outside of Tibet and Nepal, where in places like Singapore, in places like Malaysia, you have signs on Dharma centers where they say Shugden practitioners are not allowed to enter these Dharma centers. In these countries, there is democracy. In these countries, there is religious freedom. Why then do these Dharma centers feel that they're enabled, that they are somehow given the approval to deny service, to deny a place of worship to Shugden practitioners when they're not even within the Tibetan settlements? So clearly there's something very wrong when these centers outside of Tibetan settlements feel that it's okay for them to put up signs like this.
But what do you say to Sabdong Rinpoche's claim that it is the Tibetan people's right to reject Shugden? That has got nothing to do with the Central Tibetan Administration.
What I would say is that whilst it may be their private choice to do so, it's also the government's duty of care, responsibility to advise the people against actions like these. The government's care is towards the protection of rights for all of their people, regardless of whatever their choice of worship is. Their choice of worship is their personal choice, and it should not be something that the state is policing. Therefore, if the leadership, the Tibetan leadership, actually truly cared for all of their people, regardless of whatever their faith was, they should actually be advising these private businesses that, hang on, you're actually breaking Indian law when you do this. Indian law states that everybody has religious freedoms, and therefore you should not be discriminating against Shugden practitioners.
It's also against the Tibetan constitution, isn't it?
Yes, it does.
The Prime Minister also said that, in fact, Shugden people are allowed to travel, they have equal opportunities, that they're not denied any benefits whatsoever.
Yes, but the Sikyong Losong Sangye also conveniently left out the fact that you need to swear out from Shugden practice in order to actually receive your travel papers. For many people, this is not a choice that they're willing to make. Why? Because for them, their commitment to their teachers, their commitment to their practice is very, very precious. Therefore, there is a caveat when it comes to receiving travel papers in order to travel freely. In this instance, the Sikyong is actually enabling the restriction of people's freedom of movement on the basis of their faith. As soon as you cut off this travel lifeline, you are therefore putting in another blockade to ensure that the Shugden practice is eventually stamped out. On the part of the lay people, these people have been within the Tibetan settlements for 60 years, and I mean, it's quite clear to say that their standard of living has not improved very much in the last 60 years. So it makes you wonder, what has the Tibetan leadership been doing with all the donations they've received for the last 6 decades? But my point is this. For the people who still continue to live there, it is their wish and it is their right to improve their own standard of living. And if they cannot do so within the Tibetan settlements because they are denied job opportunities for the reason that they are Shugden practitioners, then of course they want to travel out. They want to go elsewhere to seek better opportunities. And they are denied this opportunity to improve their own standard of living by the leadership who don't give them travel papers because they practice Dorje Shugden. That's the only reason why they don't get travel papers, because they practice Dorje Shugden.
Now, Dorje Shugden worshippers is labeled in this video as a fringe group. A fringe group, fringe and fundamental group, out to undermine the Dalai Lama. That's a pretty wild claim, isn't it?
It is a very wild claim, and when you examine the evidence, hard evidence, photographs, videos, facts, you will see why it's a baseless accusation. They make this accusation to make Shugden practice sound very insignificant, like it's no big deal, and sort of like, why are these practitioners who are speaking up against the ban making mountains out of molehills? But if you look at the number of Shugden practitioners that exist worldwide, there are 4 million Shugden practitioners around the world. And how do you know this? Just look at the enthronement of lamas, Shugden lamas, like Dema Gonsa Rinpoche, and the number of people who attended, the number of Shugden practitioners who attended this enthronement. There were over 200,000 people who attended his enthronement in Tibet. More recently, you had the enthronement of Dagom Rinpoche, again in Tibet, and over 20,000 people attended his enthronement ceremony. Compare this with the number of Tibetans in exile. You have, 150,000 Tibetans in exile. More people, more Shugden practitioners attended Dema Gonsa Rinpoche's enthronement than there are Tibetans living in exile. So how can the Sikyong logically say that there are very, very few Shugden practitioners, that Shugden worship is a fringe practice, that it is not a mainstream practice, and that Shugden practitioners are making mountains out of molehills, that it's no big deal. It's an insignificant practice. Don't think about it. Don't talk about it. If it were that insignificant, Martin, why even release the video?
Well, that's true. Well, having said that, even if it's a small group, religious freedom should extend to all, regardless of how many worshippers belong to that religion, isn't it?
Exactly.
Now, let's move along then. In the same video, they justified how some Shugden monks have been expelled on the basis that they were expelled because they couldn't follow certain monastery rules. Can I have a comment on that?
For the last 400 years, Dorje Shugden practice has been part of the monastery's internal rules. He has been practiced on a monthly basis by all the monks as part of the 5 protectors, Vaishravana, Kalarupa, Mahakala, Pandin Lamo, etc. and Dorje Shugden. Every single month, all monks engage in this practice, whether or not it's their personal practice. So within the monastic system, Shugden has already been an accepted part of their practices. It's something that is carried out without question. All of a sudden, the monastery rules are changed. And therefore, the monks who refuse to continue relying on this deity are kicked out. After 400 years, when there's been no referendum, when nobody's been consulted, when it's been based on the decision of one person, this is not a democracy, Martin. So whilst it may be that the monastery, the monks were expelled for refusing to follow internal monastery rules, you also have to weigh it up against the 400 years of history that comes along with this practice. Should all 400 years worth of monks and lamas and practitioners be completely disregarded and discarded out of history because suddenly there's been this change, this arbitrary change in internal monastic rules?
But the CTA would say the monks are allowed to practice Dorje Shugden. You have Sepo Monastery and you have Shaganden Monastery, which are monasteries that allow Shugden practice. Now, the CTA point to these monasteries as evidence that there's no discrimination, that these monasteries have been allowed to be established precisely because the CTA upholds religious freedom.
I think that there has been a very creative interpretation of the existence of the monasteries. In fact, the mere existence of the monasteries is evidence that there is no religious freedom. These monasteries did not exist prior to the ban on Dorje Shugden. These monasteries and the monks in the monasteries were actually part of the mainstream Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. Before 96, there was no such thing as a Shugden monastery and a non-Shugden monastery. It was just monastery. As I said earlier, Shugden was part of the accepted mainstream practices of Tibetan Buddhism. The fact that these monasteries exist, therefore, is evidence that there was some kind of active movement to separate Shugden monks from non-Shugden monks, and therefore there was some kind of active discrimination against Shugden monks. And the fact these monasteries exist isn't due to the kindness of the Tibetan leadership, it's actually due to the kindness of Indian law. Indian law, which protects religious freedom, allows for the existence of these monasteries, where the Tibetan leadership actually have no legal basis for the monasteries to say that, oh, we allow these monasteries to exist. It will be very interesting to see and examine the Tibetan leadership's accounts to see how much aid, how many grants, how much financial support has been given from the Tibetan leadership to Sebom and to Shaganden over the last 20 years. If these monasteries exist due to the kindness of the Tibetan leadership, therefore, the Tibetan leadership should have been treating them equally over the last 20 years.
Thank you. Now, I just want to clarify one point. There's not really a thing called Shugden monasteries, is there? Or nor is there a Shugden cult. These are just labels that the CTA has forced upon Shugden practitioners to isolate them. All this time is just being Gelugpa monks who practice Dorje Shugden.
Correct.
Could you elaborate on that, please?
There were Gelugpa monks who relied on Dorje Shugden, and in fact, it was just our protector. It wasn't even, I practice Dorje Shugden, or I practice Mahakala, I practice Pandan Lamo. It's just, this is my protector, end of story. And the fact that they choose to use the word cult is very, well, I guess, very manipulative, because cult, if you don't understand the correct definition of the word cult elicits a very emotional, very panic-filled response. It's very alarmist. It's designed to create panic in the community without you needing to know much about the history, without you needing to know much about context. So by doing this, the CTA is showing a very direct, very intentional, active direction towards suppressing, towards actively isolating Shugden monks, as you have said.
So we see that, in fact, for the last 20 years, the Dorje Shugden ban has been based on deception. And this latest CTA video is the continuation of the same deception. It is only logical that if there's any real justification or basis for the ban, the reasons would not have to change, as we've seen it changing several times. And you wouldn't need the Prime Minister, Sikyong Losang Sangay, to come out over and over again to justify the actions, which is to ban a religion. Ultimately, we are inviting viewers to think for themselves. On the one hand, you have the CTA's ban of Dorje Shugden based on reasons that keep changing and on ongoing propaganda. And on the other hand, you've got the Dorje Shugden practitioners whose reasons to maintain the practice have never changed and have kept consistent for the last 20 years. So we invite you to think and to match what you've heard from the CTA against facts and against very simple logic. Thank you.